Let me welcome everybody. My name is Graham Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California, across the bay from San Francisco. And we are delighted to welcome everybody to our Lighthouse Briefing Call. This is the 8th in our series of Lighthouse Briefing Calls related to the COVID crisis and some of the implications of it. And so we are tackling the public policy aspects of this crisis, not so much the epidemiological aspects. We offer this as a special briefing to our wonderful donors who support us faithfully and make this work possible. Thank you all for doing that. Also to a few select friends whom we've invited. Eventually, we will make the recording available to a wider audience because we think these things are important to hear. But we want to give you guys who are standing with us as our supporters first crack, you might say. And just as a reminder, of course, our work does depend upon a generous financial support. You can go to our webpage, independent.org, and at the top right, there is a button that says donate. And of course, feel free to use that as you are so inclined. Okay, so let me just set the stage here. Welcome to Adam Summers. I'll introduce in a moment. Glad you're with us, Adam.
Thank you, Graham. Nice to be here.
Okay, so setting the stage, this crisis has a lot of spin-offs. Mostly, we have been worried here as observers on the public policy front of the ways in which governments at all levels seem to be accumulating powers and bureaucratic controls in the name of the crisis, which are kind of extraordinary. One can disagree one way or the other whether they are temporarily necessary. But based upon kind of historical perspective, we know that in the long run, when governments acquire powers in a crisis, they are reluctant to shed those powers over time. So many of our friends know this remarkable book, classic by Robert Higgs, published by the Independent Institute, Crisis and Leviathan, in which Robert Higgs, the well-known economic historian and economist, describes the way in which this ratchet process occurs. So by all means, take a look at Crisis and Leviathan for the big picture that we're trying to warn against and kind of lean against. But there may be, as today's guest Adam Summers has indicated to us, a kind of an unexpected silver lining, because governments at all levels seem to be realizing that there are a lot of kind of useless, at least in the crisis, useless governmental controls, bureaucratic restrictions, and so forth, that they've had to suspend in order to respond to the crisis. And so this is prompting many people, even across the political spectrum, not really a matter of identity or whether you're blue or whether you're red, but many people are asking, well, if these laws are hurting our response to this crisis, were they really that good an idea in the first place? So Adam Summers will give us some examples of this in a few minutes, and we'll talk a little bit about this. The question is, could COVID-19 turn out to be inadvertently the great deregulator? So Adam Summers has published recently this piece in our own Beacon blog at independent.org, also published in the Orange County Register on whether the coronavirus is the great deregulator. Adam Summers is a research fellow of the Independent Institute, has been for a number of years, has quite a remarkable career as an analyst of California affairs specifically. Adam is trained as an economist. He's written extensively in California and national politics. He's touched on such things as pension reform, individual liberty, property rights. These things have been published in the Wall Street Journal, San Francisco Chronicle, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and elsewhere. Okay, with that introduction, now we officially say, hey, Adam, glad that you are here. Glad you're part of the Independent Institute.
Well, thanks, me too.
You really have accumulated quite a body of work, and we're grateful that you're part of our team. So in this article about the coronavirus, the great deregulator, you're pointing out all these different sort of superfluous and harmful regulations that are having to be suspended, at least temporarily. And you talked about how these policies often represent a kind of heavy-handed, one-size-fits-all approach to regulation. Give us, as a starting point, please, a couple of examples of some of these regulations that have turned out to be needed to be cut back during the crisis. What are they?
Sure. Well, probably one of the most high-profile ones was at the federal level when the government was trying to put together these COVID testing kits. And they actually banned not only private labs, but even public universities and other public agencies from doing their own research and developing their own tests. Problem was the federal test turned out to not be very reliable.
Hmm.
And so they eventually had to relent and kind of open things up to other people to develop them. But by that time, weeks had gone by and the virus had continued to spread more and more. And we've kind of been playing catch up ever since.
I don't think you're saying that the CDC didn't have any business trying to develop tests. That's not your point, is it?
Well, no, not really. I mean, I would rather just see the private sector be able to come up with it, since they have the greatest incentives.
They do, exactly. It seems like wouldn't be so bad if they were doing it, so long as they weren't stopping everybody else from doing it.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of the problem. And you mentioned that a lot of these laws that the governments at all levels have been suspending were kind of useless. They're not only useless, in a lot of cases they're counterproductive, and that's why they were kind of forced to relax their own laws.
What about masks? Talk about masks. Is that in the same category of thing?
It is, yeah. There's a certification process that has to be done before hospitals are even allowed to order these masks, and they were prevented, as you know, from the outbreak. The supplies were tight because everyone was in need of masks. Now there are medical masks, the N95. There's also industrial N95 masks. Mm-hmm. But they weren't.
I got confused between those two the other day. I got one last year at Home Depot, but it turns out it's not the right one.
Oh, I see. Well, there apparently there's some regulation that you're not allowed to use the industrial N95 masks in the hospital setting. So they actually had to pass a law in mid-March to allow them to do that. And
because the industrial one would be, way better than nothing in the hospital setting, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're functionally exactly the same. So
what was the point of the restriction in the first place?
I'm not exactly sure, but I probably has something to do with either some bureaucrat wanting to wield control or some special interest. That
I was going to say special interest. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got the question about the private, the tests being forbidden to be developed initially by private mm-hmm. labs. Restrictions on the production of essential masks, those had to be lifted. You mentioned telemedicine. Was there restrictions on that?
There was. The HIPAA privacy law prevented Medicare providers from utilizing telemedicine services. Now, other people that were not in the Medicare system had figured out a way to do this, apparently. Because the doctors have been doing this for a little while now.
Oh yeah, it's become pervasive by now.
Yeah. So again, they had to suspend that rule to allow telemedicine to Medicare patients for obvious reasons. They didn't want people going to the doctor and potentially spreading the disease. And obviously, it's more convenient for patients, but as you alluded to earlier, why not allow people to do that during normal times?
I mean, I can just imagine the thinking, though, on the part of some medical regulating bureaucrats who might have said, well, senior citizens don't like high tech, so let's forbid them from even having access to the high tech because it's for their own good.
Yeah. That is kind of the pervasive mentality, and it's kind of a shame. But
I mean, had they been allowed to develop it sort of on their own terms, the different providers, they probably would have figured out that some of their patients did well with telemedicine, others didn't. Mm-hmm. But instead, the whole thing was blocked off until, out of the necessity of the COVID crisis, they had to lift it, right? And so now they're doing Medicare telemedicine. Thank goodness.
Yeah, and a lot of the private insurance companies have been pushing telemedicine because it saves on costs for them and for the doctors as well. They can see more patients in a shorter amount of time. So, if that's the way the market's going, then why prevent it?
Okay, some more examples, like talk about occupational licensing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was a big one as well. Every state has their own occupational licensing laws. The healthcare field, doctors and nurses and so forth, every state licenses them. But while there are some reciprocity agreements between some states where they will recognize someone that's licensed in another state, a lot of states don't have those agreements, and so doctors and nurses were prevented from crossing state lines. You may remember that the governor of New York actually put out a call to health workers across the country to come to New York and help New York City specifically, to
Which was
try to
great.
help with their, yeah.
It was great, but to do that, they had to like lower their own previously enacted restrictions on doing so, right?
Precisely, yeah. And so, I mean, this is an issue that's near and dear to me. I've written about occupational licensing for a number of years now. I did a fairly lengthy study back when I was working at the Reason Foundation. And, you know, what you find when you look at these licensing laws is that they always kind of push these laws on the basis that it's going to benefit public safety. But when you really get into it, there's a wealth of economic literature that says, no, that's not the case. Really, all they tend to do is restrict competition, and that allows the existing practitioners to raise their prices. And there isn't any real benefit to the consumers. In fact, there's a significant harm. And because there's less competition, that affects other things like the amount of innovation in the industry. So, you know, people might say, well, you know, if you're talking about florists and tree trimmers, that's not such a big deal. But if it comes to something like doctors, where life is on the line, we need to have licensing. I would argue quite the opposite, that because it's that much more important, there will be all that much more incentive to provide information
and scrutiny.
To customers. And you'll have, you know, there are already services like Rate MD and Yelp and all sorts of things that help rate doctors and health facilities and so forth. Doctors also have a board certification for various specialties. If you didn't have a state licensing, I think you would still have something like that or something similar that would allow the doctors to indicate that they have certain expertise. And you'd probably have a variety of other agencies that would be providing some sort of private voluntary certification.
So you and other economists have mounted kind of a long-term argument about the counterproductive character of these occupational licensing laws. Of course, I buy that, and many others do too. But even short of people who, you know, see that whole argument, people are also recognizing that at least on the margins, a lot of these licensure things need to be rolled back, like the cross state lines and mutual recognition and so forth. I mean, they don't go all the way to abolishing them like you would advocate, but it's still an improvement. And people are saying, well,
that's essentially what Arizona did recently. They essentially said, we're going to recognize licenses from other states for a wide variety of occupations. And then a couple states, I think maybe New Mexico and Wyoming, followed suit in the last couple of years or so. So there is a little bit of momentum, but in general, it's very difficult to roll those things back because there's such a vested interest among the existing practitioners to keep and enhance those licensing. I also think it's kind of telling that a lot of the time when those licensing laws are enacted, they tend to grandfather in the existing practitioners. So they're only applying them to their future competition.
Yeah, it becomes a barrier to entry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but the thing is, there's a deep dug-in vested interest behind these licensure requirements, but the tide of necessity is pushing hard against it right now with this COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people who are not part of the vested interest are starting to wake up and say, looks like we really are being harmed by these restrictions. Maybe we should roll them back and let people, you know, practice their profession more broadly without all these bureaucratic restrictions. So Adam, going on, one of the things that just astonished me when I read your article, I'm you know, a layman when it comes to any of this kind of stuff, was the certificate of need laws. Mm-hmm. Explain what that means, because I was kind of stunned.
Yeah, these are particularly pernicious, and they're more common in the health industry, although they've also been used for other industries like moving vans and so forth. But basically what they say is that if you want to open up a new hospital, you have to not only get the permission of the government, but in effect, you have to get the permission of all the other hospitals in the area where you might be pulling business from. So you'd have to get permission from your competitors. and they'll have a hearing to figure out if you can prove that there's some sort of need, not only that there's a need, but that also that you won't harm your other competitors. And this is kind of like a legal hearing, which is very expensive and stressful, and one of your potential competitors could simply stand up and say, "This is going to harm my business," and so we shouldn't allow this new
Wow.
entrant into the market. And
Mhm.
that's enough generally to kill someone's application. So this applies not only to opening hospitals, but if you want to add a certain number of hospital beds,
Oh,
if you
right.
want to acquire certain medical equipment, if you want to start an ambulance company. In fact, there's a case going on right now. I think Pacific Legal Foundation is taking it up, where there's a gentleman who lives somewhere in the Midwest. I can't remember exactly which state, but he lives right near the state border, and so he practices on his side of the border. He started up this ambulance company with one van. Now he's got 6 or 7,
Mm-hmm.
and he can run his service. I think he does just non-emergency service, but he can transport someone to a hospital across the state line, which is only a mile or two away from where he lives and runs his business. But he can transport someone to a hospital across that state border. But since they have these certificate of need laws, he can't bring someone from that hospital back. They can't
Oh,
return them home
okay.
to his state.
Okay.
And he's tried a number of times, and so they're challenging the law in that state. Um,
But
but yeah,
they were
it's
challenging it before this crisis, but must have gotten more acute because what if you're caring for a COVID patient and space available, you go where the space is available, but you can't go across the state line
right, exactly.
without a certificate of needs certification thing that
Hmm.
some of your competitors have signed off on.
Yeah, so it's really outrageous restriction on competition and market activity in general. There was a study that looked into the effects of this, and I think it said there was something like 30% fewer medical facilities in states that had these laws, and so it
Wow.
really has a significant impact
I
on
mean, I'm going
business
to
cases.
quote you here, Adam, but it's sort of like telling local McDonald's that they can weigh in on whether or not Burger King can open across the street.
Right, or can you imagine, asking Walmart if a Costco should go in or something? It's
So
crazy.
are these certificate of need laws being rolled back in this crisis in any way at all, or are we waiting for that to happen?
They are. Let's see. I think 15 or 20 of them at last count had suspended them
So you
or
mean 15 or 20 states?
relaxed them in some measure.
15 or
Yeah, but
20
not all
states?
of them.
Okay. Hmm. So in other words, the pressure's on there too.
Yes, indeed.
Good thing. A lot of people have noticed that there's some kind of weird variation in our current so-called shelter-in-place restrictions. It seems like alcohol and marijuana can be delivered, but other things can't. Talk
Right.
to us about some of these restrictions.
Sure. Well, this kind of gets to what the government arbitrarily determines is a necessary business, right? And there was a tailor in New York City that made this very point. He decided to open up his shop against the local and state rules. And when he was being interviewed about this, he said, "How come a liquor store is determined to be a necessary business, but my business is not?" And and why not indeed? I think the answer is
Right.
probably because there is a big constituency for people who want alcohol and in some
Mhm.
states marijuana, which can also be delivered now. Um, and when it couldn't be delivered before the crisis in some cases. Um, and I think politicians basically feared an uproar if people weren't allowed access to
Yeah,
these
I
sorts
think
of
that's
things.
probably right. I mean, there were states, some of whom were restricting sales of ammunition for
Mhm.
legal firearms, but were allowing sales of marijuana so you could get high, but you couldn't protect your family.
Right,
Like
and this at the
scratch your
same
head on
time
that
when
one.
Yeah, at the same time, a lot of the states and local governments were releasing prisoners because they feared outbreaks in the correctional facilities. And so, at a time when potentially things are getting more dangerous, you're not allowed to protect yourself. There are some states that had violated Second Amendment rights by simply refusing to process the background checks or by ordering gun stores closed. And we saw that initially in California, although they kind of relaxed that a little bit. Although I think in certain pockets like Los Angeles County, it's still kind of iffy. So,
but I think, not to lose track of the main point here, what's going on as people see these kind of weird variations in what's allowed and what isn't, and what's restricted and what needs to be unrestricted, the thing that we're noticing overall is this pattern that Americans of all stripes are starting to see the virtues of regulatory rollback, and we really want to help them see that, so we can not only get through the crisis better, but also be better off after the crisis is over. So I do have a couple of written questions here for Adam Summers, but here's a question. Someone wrote in, I'm wondering about relaxed childcare regulations.
Yes, this is something we've actually seen in California, of all places. California has rolled back, at least temporarily, some of the rules regarding the ages of kids that can be in childcare for people that have certain licenses, and the hours, because normally you would have the kids home during school hours, but of course there's no school right now, and so that has caused some disruption and some changes in needs. And another thing that they have relaxed is the ability to prioritize the children of what are deemed to be the essential workers over non-essential workers, to help them out, since they are, some of the relative few, at least initially, that were working in sometimes long hours. So it's interesting that even California has recognized that we need to loosen up some of these laws.
Because people need childcare, and it doesn't really make sense to protect them to such a degree that it harms them.
Right.
I mean, that's basically what it comes down to.
California is very good about doing that.
Indeed. I mean, we're the Independent Institute, Adam knows as well, but for a reminder to some of our friends on the call, the Independent Institute is involved in an effort to roll back, at least temporarily, this kind of crazy piece of California legislation called AB5, which restricts what independent contractors can do. It has forced all sorts of writers, artists, musicians, Lyft drivers, gig delivery service people, all have been put in a very bad position economically because it restricts their ability to freely contract their services. And a lot of people who'd like to earn money while they can't go out are restricted from doing so because of this bill. We've got an open letter with 151 California economists and political scientists advocating at least temporary rollback, and expect more to come on this point, because people are realizing, we thought it was good to protect workers, but it turns out it's keeping me from making money. And so AB5 needs to be lifted so that independent contractors can earn a living and support themselves in this crisis and afterwards.
Just to tie that into the theme from today, they quickly realized that this was going to be a big problem and that the law was very overly broad and sloppily written. And so their solution so far has been to just exempt a number of various occupations and industries, which again just kind of illustrates how arbitrary the whole thing is. And
got to pass a law that hurts everybody, but I want my group to get an exception from this bad law.
Exactly.
Let's just roll back the whole bad law. So here's another written question. Someone writes in, why were some regulations such as purchasing alcoholic beverages in a to-go cup so easily and quickly relaxed?
Yeah, I think we kind of addressed that, and it's just that it would be so unpopular politically for the politicians to do that they kind of feared that people are saying I have to stay home all the time and I'm not even allowed to to get some alcohol from the local restaurant. So I think they just feared that kind of blowback from that.
I have some others that have come in here. Well, this is a very general question for Adam Summers. Will too much easing of regulations put us at risk?
No, I don't think so. First of all, we've seen how arbitrary the regulations are in the first place. And to harken back to the occupational licensing example, you look at states that are, right next to each other. Compare California and Arizona, for example, where
Hmm.
Arizona's, even before they had this massive reciprocity kind of agreement, they regulated a lot less than California. Yet you didn't see people dying or being hurt by practitioners in that state in any
That's right. Yeah.
significantly larger numbers than in California. So, uh, I think people put a little bit too much faith in the standards to begin with. If I could use another licensing example, that tends to have counterproductive effects because people, when they just kind of trust the government license or whatever the regulation might tend to be, they take less care on their own. And so you see
Yeah.
cases
Right.
where
Mhm.
where people end up getting harmed more because they just kind of take it at face value that the licensee is qualified, and in a lot of cases they're not, and that's going to be the case whether you have licensing or not. Um, I think the bad practitioners will tend to get weeded out a lot quicker and more efficiently when you have a robust, competitive free market system.
One of our participants just sent me a chat question here. He says, this is from Mark. He said he saw an article in The Atlantic which quoted a University of Minnesota economist estimate that licensing costs consumers nearly $200 billion annually.
Mhm.
What do you think the effects would be if that amount of money, that is to say 200 billion, if that amount of money stayed in the private sector?
Precisely, and I think that was probably Morris Kleiner, who's respected.
It's by Paul Sherman, he says,
Oh,
but
okay.
in The Atlantic recently, apparently.
Yeah, well, the you can imagine what if people had a couple $100 billion of disposable income, uh, well, I mean, they would spend it, they would save it, people would deal with it in a variety of ways. But I think it's safe to say that people would be in better position to deal with crises like this
Mhm,
financially,
mhm.
and they would be better to pursue their happiness rather than having that money
Yeah,
simply wasted.
I'll say. Oh, and by the way, Mark, the participant on this chat box, it says it was Morris Kleiner, so you were on the right track.
Mhm.
Just for clarification. We're going to close in a couple minutes here. So if you have questions you want to ask, by all means, raise your hands in the chat box and let me know. But kind of a concluding summary question from me, at least, is how can we make these temporary suspensions of counterproductive laws permanent?
Well, there are a number of things that both we at the Independent Institute and other free market think tanks are doing here. We're trying to kind of get the word out through blogs and op-eds like mine about just kind of spreading the word on how useless and counterproductive these types of regulations are to begin with, to kind of start from the ground up and put some pressure on politicians to roll these laws back. Uh, the Competitive Enterprise Institute has started this project where they have this hashtag never needed, and they've been collecting a
That's a
list.
good hashtag.
They've been collecting a list of all of these regulations that have been suspended. And one thing I think that would be very helpful is something I'm going to borrow a suggestion from some scholars from Mercatus Center. And they suggested doing a BRAC type of commission. If you remember going back to the late 80s, there was a problem with too many underutilized and unnecessary military bases. So they
Yes.
came up with this base realignment and closing, or BRAC commission. And this commission went through and kind of detailed where all of the waste was. Now there's a huge problem in Congress where you have this log rolling where one congressman will say, I'll scratch your back and support your special interest perk if you support mine. And that's certainly the case with military bases and anything having to do with the defense industry, honestly. So what they did was, when the commission finished its analysis, they put all of their recommendations into a single package, so they wouldn't be able to divide them up and vote on them individually. It was just a simple up or down vote on all of them, and that prevented some of this log rolling. And I think we should be doing something similarly, not only at the federal level, but on the individual state level as well, for these types of regulations that we've seen are counterproductive.
Absolutely. And just, as a kind of a final word to our friends on this call, um, as individuals, we do sometimes feel sort of powerless, but in fact, there is a tide of opinion shifting in the right direction. We are trying to get the word out here at the Independent Institute. Adam Summers' work is part of that. There's a lot more as well. And so I encourage you, first of all, not to be discouraged, and to talk about these things with your educated friends and the public. Feel free to share our resources here from the Independent Institute with your friends across your networks. You can go to independent.org and you will find toward the top left, there is a button with COVID materials, and we have a bunch of materials there, written pieces, videos, and other things that you can actually share readily. I invite you, please, to continue your support for the Independent Institute. Our work, I think, has more resonance now than ever for some of the reasons we've been discussing. And so we would be grateful for your continued support for our work, and thank you for it. So with that said, let me thank Adam Summers. Thanks for all the work you did and for what you did today.
Well, thanks. If I could just leave you with a closing thought here. There's a quote I'd like to mention from Milton Friedman. This was his Capitalism and Freedom book. And he said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change.
Mm-hmm.
When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good lesson, not only for the COVID crisis, but in our mission generally, and particularly if you talk about California, we have a very difficult political climate to try to get real change in most areas. But I think just keeping that idea in mind will kind of help us to rededicate ourselves to keeping that message alive.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. That is a really good word. Thank you for Adam Summers. Thanks to everybody who joined us, and to all of our friends around the country. Take care and good day from the Independent Institute.